Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. We actually had a wonderful preview of today's presentation back in October during Humanities Week, and I'm really looking forward to continuing our conversation with Shawn Micallef. But before I begin, I'd like to start with the HRG land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement is drawn from the one crafted by Vicky Leong for the law school, and we appreciate her contribution and guidance. So today we gather in the notion of peace and friendship. The University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. As part of the University of Windsor community, the Humanities Research Group is committed in working to ensure Indigenous traditions and perspectives are fully acknowledged and respected in our teaching, research, and community engagement. As a community partner, we hope to share in the process of learning the stories shared in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee report so that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples transform Canadian society so that our children and grandchildren can live together in dignity, peace, and prosperity in these lands we now share. Now, also quoted in the report, by listening to your story, my story can change. By listening to your story, I can change. In making this land acknowledgement, we're showing our commitment to learn from our past to inform our future. And I want to reinforce the message from previous years that HRG is not only committed to acknowledging our Indigenous heritage, but we include Indigenous stories and perspectives in our programming of events. And I draw your attention to the full HRG schedule featured in the Athenian newsletter and online. So before I turn things over, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about the HRG for those of you who might be first learning of us. The Humanities Research Group is an interdisciplinary council comprised of University of Windsor faculty, students, staff, and community members who support humanities research and facilitate events where thinkers and audience members grapple with issues relating to the human condition. We are committed to engaging our community on campus, in the city, and in our region, with interdisciplinary ideas and perspectives of complexity and weight that are central to our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. Our goal is to bring students, faculty, and Windsorites together to challenge, inspire, and stimulate in a space of open dialogue, sharing, and exchange. Now, to get things going, I'm going to be asking Dr. Annika Smit to introduce our guest speaker. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. Annika Smit is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law and the inaugural Director of the Windsor Law Centre for Cities. She is the co-lead of the Government of Canada-funded Cities and Climate Action Forum. Dr. Smit's research, teaching, and community engagement focus on urban planning and municipal law, and as well as global refugee law and policy. She is the author of several books and numerous academic articles on domestic and global refugee law, policy with government, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations in Canada, the Balkans, and the South Caucasus. Her extensive community involvement includes 2 terms as founding member of the National Scholars at Risk Steering Committee and founding the Windsor Essex chapter of the Refugee Sponsorship Program, Refugee SSP. She is a regular commentator in English and French language media on urban planning issues and refugee law and policy. She is also no stranger to the HRG. Among her many awards and accolades, she has held an HRG fellowship. So with that, I turn it over to Professor Smit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miljan. And yes, I'm very grateful to the HRG for the support that they provided a few years ago and to the ongoing support that they provide to faculty members across campus to pursue our research with humanities focus or intersections, even for those of us working sort of outside of those spaces. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Shawn Micallef to you today. And to be a part of this conversation. Shawn Micallef is the author of Frontier City, Toronto on the Verge of Greatness, Stroll, Psychogeographic Walking Tours of Toronto, and The Trouble with Brunch, Work, Class, and the Pursuit of Leisure. He's a weekly columnist at the Toronto Star, a senior editor and co-owner of the independent Jane Jacobs Prize-winning Spacing magazine. Shawn teaches at the University of Toronto, was a 2011 and 12 Canadian Journalism Fellow at the University of Toronto's Massey College, in 2002 while a resident at the Canadian Film Center's Media Lab. He co-founded Murmur, the location-based mobile phone documentary project that has spread to over 25 cities globally. I'll mention his Twitter feed as well if you're not following him already. Everything from the big issues on urban practice to the micro level experience of the city, very much worth a follow. And I want also to say what's particularly relevant to us today is Shawn's deep Windsor and Windsor connections, and we're grateful to be able to call him a product of both our city and our university, having grown up in Windsor, a double Windsor grad, including an MA in political science. A commitment ongoing to the city, even in the years since he left. And I know what I've sensed with Shawn is with many ex-Windsorites is an ongoing commitment, even while not living in the city, but staying very much committed. We recently hosted the Canadian Urban Institute in Windsor for a 3-day listening tour, and Shawn was a part of one of our 3 public events on that. He has continued to be committed as well to Windsor law. He wrote a piece for our 50th anniversary book. So someone whose work I appreciate both on a global or more sort of global urban practice level, as well as on the local level, the commitment to your hometown, and that is what we're seeing manifested today as well. It's my pleasure to welcome you, Shawn. We'll ask Shawn, who was speaking to us for I think 45 minutes or so ish. After which I'm pleased to say that my municipal law students from Windsor Law are with us, and 3 of them, Gashminas, Ember Chapdelaine, and Claudia Grabkowska, will ask the first 3 questions, at which point we'll open the floor for discussion. Thanks so much, Shawn, and welcome.
Thanks, Professors Schmidt and Miljan, for that. It's really nice to be back. Yeah, I don't know if I made the right decision at the end of undergrad. I was going to go to either Windsor Law or the grad department at University of Windsor for poli-sci. I think I did make the right decision, but always in the back of my head, it was like, what would my life have been like if I went to law?
You made the right decision.
Thanks. I do wonder if I. No, I think they're equal. Anyway, I'm really happy to chat about a few things about the city in general, but also Windsor. There'll be a lot of Toronto in it, and some Canadian cities as I go. And the kind of framing of this, of what I'm going to talk about, is the pandemic, as it frames everything, really. But at the beginning of the pandemic, as everyone kind of shifted to work from home, and the cities sort of became empty, and then there were stories of people leaving cities and moving to the countryside because they could, work from home and that sort of thing. There are all these kind of hot takes out there, articles about, is this the end of the cities? Is this the end of, us living together in compact forms? Which is not the case, I would say. But we'll kind of get into that. But the pandemic has been really challenging for cities, but also opened up a lot of opportunities. So I'll talk about a bit of that. So I'll just get right into it. And if I can figure out how to move my slides up, I will do that. There we are. Good. Yeah, I grew up in Windsor, first 25 years of my life, and went to University of Windsor. And when people ask like why I do what I do, why am I so into cities, I think it's because I came from Windsor. It's the city that I learned what urbanism was, because Windsor's an interesting city at the street level. It's still intact. The bones, as urbanists like to say, are all there. But also we have this great front row view of one of the great American cities, Detroit, and still do. As in watching, the rise of Detroit, and then the fall of Detroit, and then the rise again over the last couple decades. It's been like a front row seat to one city's really dramatic story, and I think Windsor probably understands Detroit more than most Americans, I imagine, because of all the news and that sort of thing that we consume from across the river. Even like I still tell temperature better in Fahrenheit because watching the Detroit news channels than in Celsius. I do the little calculus in my head. So there's something really valuable and unique about being a border city. There's lots of, the Canadian-American border is really long, but Detroit is, in Windsor, is like two big cities, one really big one. So you get such a interesting cross-pollination and understanding, for that the relationship really that defines Canada is our relationship with Americans. And up here in like Toronto, it's a little more abstract, that relationship. It's, it's about, trade deals and maybe driving to Buffalo to go shopping or something, or visiting friends. Whereas Windsor and Detroit have this everyday relationship, from families, cross-border shopping, cross-border dating, cross-border families. And so, yeah, Windsor taught me everything I know because of this great position as a border town. But throughout my 25 years of living in Windsor before I moved to Toronto, I was looking back on it once I moved to Toronto and started doing what I do now, going to City Hall, paying attention to city council meetings, trying to understand how the city ticks, and maybe what its future will be. I realized, looking back, that despite doing political science, I barely paid attention to the municipal level, and the goings on at City Hall. This is the old City Hall, of course. I know there's a new one. I just really like this one, this mid-century one that was built around 1955. It was a real beauty. Windsor actually has some really wonderful examples of mid-century modern architecture. But yeah, I overlooked this place. It was like the important stuff seemed to happen at higher levels of government, international, political theory, and I think that was a mistake. The couple of courses I teach at university, and that's not just Windsor. A lot of people here in Toronto don't pay attention to Toronto politics. During each election, I know city councillors who go canvassing have to can tell people what city councillors do at door to door, because there's such a kind of overlooking of the municipal level. So I've been trying to catch up on that. But I think it is a Canadian thing of overlooking our cities. This is the mythology of Canada is really about the landscape, which there's a ton of, and some of it is quite dramatic. I really love this picture of Calgary. It has the Rockies are in the background, and it kind of almost shrinks the city itself, even though there's the Bow Tower, which is the highest building, I think, west of Toronto, and yet it looks tiny compared to the Rockies. And a beautiful city like Vancouver, the shots, the kind of mythological pictures of Vancouver are always of the mountains above North and West Vancouver. Peter C. Newman, who was the former editor of Saturday Night Magazine and Maclean's, probably in his 90s now, still around. But he had this line where he said, "In Vancouver, all human endeavor has to compete with God, because the natural landscape, the mountains, the ocean, are so dramatic that the stuff people do almost takes a back seat." And I think that kind of applies all across the country. Maybe a little less so in Ontario, because even though I really like our landscape here, it's a bit more subtle. We don't really have Rockies. We have some ski hills. Often they're built on former garbage dumps, like here in Toronto. Those are our mountains, so people in the West laugh at us maybe. But the cities maybe don't have as much to compete with here. So even in Toronto, we have this giant lake, which is a wilderness across the way. But yeah, despite overlooking cities and them and being kind of in the background of our landscapes, the Canadian cities have really punched above their weight, despite being relatively small themselves, and the population of Canada relatively small to other countries around the world. So between 1967 and 2010, we've had 3 Olympics and 2 important expos, Vancouver in '86 and of course Montreal in '67. Huge city festivals that are great tourist attractions, from the Toronto International Film Festival, Montreal Jazz, Caravana, Freedom Festival in Windsor. We have some of the biggest pride parades in the world, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. And our Canadian cities, the biggest ones, are often on these lists, sometimes with dubious methodology of, great best places to live, safest places to live, highest quality of living. So despite them being somewhat ignored, there's something going on here that's interesting. Professor Smith mentioned one of the things I did was with some other enthusiastic Torontonians started this magazine called Spacing, now suddenly 17 years ago. Still continues on as a quarterly magazine plus our daily blog postings. It's still an indie magazine. It's not a way to get rich in Canada by starting a magazine, but you can find a crowd to kind of keep it chugging along. And Spacing really is both a celebration and a critique of cities. Toronto focused, but we like to kind of expand it across the country when we can. And so, we cover politics and urban design, architecture, public art, in culture. But as well, we kind of try to celebrate the city at the same time. And one of the things we stumbled into early on in doing the magazine was these subway buttons. When we were meeting in our bedrooms, because we didn't have an office, we needed to find ways to get more revenue in, because the magazine itself wasn't, kind of doing it. And so we kind of had this brainstorm of doing subway buttons. Each subway station in Toronto has a unique tile pattern, kind of subtle sometimes, but we in Adobe Illustrator, I think it was, mocked the tile patterns and started selling them at our events, because we would have magazine launches, and people started buying them, and then buying them and buying them. And for the first 4 or 5 years, these button sales, $1 each, kept our magazine afloat. They were able to let us pay the printer right away. And one time we sold a bunch of them before the holidays, and we bought a couch for the office that we finally got. And so it was like, oh, that's interesting that these kind of tchotchkes ended up being a really kind of personal connection that people had to it. We would see people post on Flickr and other kind of websites their button collections. They would make a map of the thing. And yeah, so it was this light bulb moment that, like, given the chance, people actually have an affection for the place that they live, despite the complaints. Even though, like, Toronto, even though it has a reputation as being, self-involved, or the center of the universe and all that sort of thing, nobody will run down Toronto quicker than a Torontonian, right? There's this kind of almost self-loathing in the city, which is changing slowly, maybe thanks to Drake and some others. But we found on a really small scale, giving people the chance to just kind of express some love for the place, it kind of came. So he's expanded with the buttons, and did Montreal buttons, Montreal subway buttons, and some neighborhood buttons. I think we might have done some other Calgary buttons at some point, that sort of thing. And then that evolved into, about 6 or 7 years ago, we opened a store. In downtown Toronto, which is like a city store, selling some of the stuff we make. But we found at our events, we tapped into this great love that people had, and people were making all kinds of stuff, like framed pictures of old streetcars and books and pillows and all kinds of stuff. So we ended up opening a store in 401 Richmond and Spadina, near Queen Street, and it's been a mild success. Again, no one gets rich off this, but it keeps our little concern chugging along. And once we kind of provided the space for people to sell their stuff, kind of on commission, they all kind of came out of the woodwork, which was really interesting. And we saw, like, all kinds of ridiculous stuff, like soap, like neighborhood soap. And I was like, when we got this stuff, I was like, who's going to buy Parkdale soap or Scarborough soap? And people buy it. So there's this weird kind of interesting affection for the place that kind of can manifest somewhat commercially. And I think it's a real testament that where people live is identity, even if they might not admit it at first glance, or at first mention of it. When nudged a little bit, there's a pride in where people are from. And it's been kind of exciting over the last decade, maybe, or a little more, to see how much Windsor products and kind of celebration of Windsor there's been, from little prints of neighborhood maps and lots of, like, YQG kind of becoming a tagline of all sorts, and just a lot of really neat kind of Windsor love coming out. I didn't want to rearrange my stupid background, but over on another part of it, in my room, I've got the Windsor pizza here. which I took off, and I got the Windsor minivan, of course. So these kind of like things that I didn't really think about in my kind of life. People would talk about pizza, and the minivan was omnipresent. When you kind of like package it in a sort of way and celebrate it as this thing we do, or this kind of regional identity, it's a good thing. And my theory is that if you want people to fight for a place, to make it better, they need to love it. They need to kind of like it. They need to maybe fall in love with their city. So I think this stuff, even though it's a little commercial and maybe sometimes cheesy, not these ones in particular, but a little silly, a little whimsical, I think it does create a sort of love of place. And if somebody loves a place, maybe then they'd go to a city council meeting. Maybe then they'd start a committee to get involved. But if they don't love the place, why would anyone pay attention to it? So I do think somewhere in the back of our brains, these two things kind of go together. As well, being represented in art and literature is really important. And growing up, there weren't that many times Windsor became a place. I remember there was a Harrison Ford movie, and I forget which one it was. It was some kind of thriller movie from like 1987, and they filmed it in Detroit. But also a little bit, they used the bobble boat at the Peace Fountain Park, sort of to be like a commuter ferry, and it was like, oh look, Windsor, and it was such a big deal. But there's, that has changed over the years a little bit. These are just two really recent things. I got a chance to read a brand new book, which is out, I think, in January or February, by Robert Earl Stewart, Toronto poet and writer. He might have went to Biblioasis. He used to be behind the counter there as well. He wrote a book about running, and how running kind of saved his life, he says. But the city of Windsor lives in the book. And so reading it, to give this blurb for it, which I happily did, Windsor was a character in it, and he goes back into the 90s when he used to play in a rock and roll band in Windsor, and I just really loved seeing so many parts of the city that I knew and know reflected back in literature, in nonfiction in this case. Ojibwe Park, Black Oak, Willisted, the Riverside, all these kind of little details. It's like, oh, someone else notices that too. And if you pass through Toronto in the next months, maybe you come up on train or something, and in Union Station, there's a piece of art. Up here, we're having this thing called the Year of Public Art. So there's all kinds of public art projects. You could come up here and be a tourist at public art if you want. But there's a huge piece. This is a slightly crummy picture I took last weekend in the Great Hall, Arrival Hall of Union Station. And it's called House of Bobby, and it's by one of the artists behind it is Camille Turner, who some of you may remember. About 5 or 6 years ago, she was doing research. She's an artist based here in Toronto. Her Twitter handle is Afrofuturist, so she does a lot of interesting stuff under that moniker. But she was doing research at the Bobby House Museum and found that the Bobby family were slave owners in Windsor, in Detroit, and in Toronto, because up here we have a neighborhood called Bobby Point up above the Humber River, quite a wealthy neighborhood. And they did this piece, this large-scale photograph in Union Station, and it's as you move by it, it's like it has one of those like little filters on it that where the image kind of changes. Sometimes it's like a little, you have those things on rulers or whatever. This is a large scale of that, and you have this kind of blurred crowd, and 18 or 19 different faces as you move across it will come into view, and they represent theoretically the descendants of the Bobby family's slaves that they held. So there's this kind of much higher quality, much more depth to the storytelling, to the stories that we're telling now, than growing up. Because this was all new to me when Camille uncovered this. So yeah, there's a bit of Toronto represented in, a bit of Windsor represented in Toronto right now. Did I just skip one? No, this is a neat project that popped up about 8 years ago here in Toronto. Ogima Makana, Reclaiming or Renaming. There's just like the most perfunctory level kind of tokenism to Indigenous names in Toronto, like the name Toronto itself. But even that is a very bad translation. And there's occasional other very bad derivative translations of Indigenous names, despite the fact that the colonial history here is about 175 years, but 10 to 12,000 years of human history have been uncovered by archaeologists here. So there's an incredible amount of history. When people say there's no history in Toronto or other Canadian cities, it's because they're not looking deep enough. So this project, it was started as a guerrilla project by a professor at Ryerson, ex-university named Hayden King, and he and a few of his students went to Spadina Road Spadina Road near Casa Loma, so our fake castle that we have here in Toronto. And the City of Toronto signs, the one on the left there, it was branded, they have kind of neighborhood branding. Sometimes it's Chinatown, Greektown. This one was DuPont by the castle. DuPont Street is nearby, and the castle being Casa Loma. And it would have said Spadina there. And what they did was put the original Indigenous name that Spadina was derived from, Ishpadina, which means place on a hill, because there is a big escarpment in the middle of the city there. And it was a guerrilla project. They put stickers around on other signs in Toronto, and it got some news coverage, and then the city came along and took them off because people probably would get lost or something. But then, as it kind of went through the motions, the city made it permanent. So now there's the one on the right. Spadina Road is still the road, but the kind of neighborhood moniker up top in Anishinaabe is Ishpadina. So that it's a neat example of something that was a guerrilla project becoming permanent. This is Davenport Road, one of the oldest roads in Toronto. That was a portage route from the Humber to the Don Rivers, which the British kind of just used once they got here, and they've also put the original Indigenous name for that up. Another project, I don't know if it's reached Windsor yet, but it's definitely Ontario-wide. It was started just before the pandemic, maybe 2018. 2017, by Carolyn King, who was the former chief of the Mississauga of the New Credit, and it's the Moccasin Identifier Project. And the picture here is of the entrance to Trillium Park at Ontario Place, which was redone in 2017, and in these granite walls are moccasins in the same style as were worn by the Indigenous people of this place. And they have, as the project goes on, they work with school kids and have stencils of the moccasins that were worn by the people that lived in that area, and go into the school, and the students will stencil with spray paint or paint on sidewalks and roads to try to show that people have been walking here for that long. And I think it was kind of put on hold for the pandemic, but before, I still see the stencils around. So I don't know if you're working with school kids, I think they have a whole toolkit on their site. So if you just Google Moccasin Identifier Project, you can figure out ways to engage. So these are all surface level stuff, and I would say a start to better understanding and repairing this relationship. But compared to what I grew up with, it's worlds away. So kind of getting back to exploring, understanding the city. When I moved to Toronto after living in Windsor, and I got up here, and I was a little nervous, not nervous, but I thought I knew Toronto from these visits, going up to see plays, Phantom of the Opera, back in the 90s, and that sort of thing, visiting friends who went to U of T. But when I got here, I realized I didn't really know the place. I only knew a few places, so I started walking. And walking a lot, taking the subway out to a station and just walking around there and exploring, because it was sort of what I was into. And then I found other people that were into it here in Toronto, some of whom I started spacing with, but also people who wrote about walking and were using walking as artistic practices and that sort of thing. There's a book out in 2000 by Rebecca Solnit called Wanderlust, A History of Walking. And she said in the book, cities move at the speed of walking, because when you're walking, you can smell things, you can overhear things, you can stop and pause and look at things, whereas anything else is too fast and you're missing the details. So I've read this book actually a few times. It became sort of my Bible of walking, and also a nice, I thought maybe it was a little bit of a waste of time to do all this walking, and it's like, oh no, look, other people have used it in different ways, and it's a good thing to do. And I still, during the pandemic, have walked more, and even sometimes when I think I have walked too much in Toronto, because it's sort of my job sometimes to write about it, walk and write about the city. All these pandemic walks, because there was nothing else to do, I kept discovering more stuff. And now when I go back to Windsor, I realize that I really only saw Windsor through a windshield because I drove every day. And I feel guilty about that. So when I go back, I try to rediscover Windsor in various ways. And one thing that happened maybe 9 years ago, I was driving along Droulard and by the Chrysler minivan plant, and pulled over and was like, this place is big. I used to drive by this every day. I used to work at Hiram Walkers, at the end of my shift, I would come down Droulard to get to Walkers. And I realized that I didn't really know how big the place was because I only ever drove by it. So I took a picture and tweeted it out and said, like, hey, you people, whoever you are in the world, my followers, you've probably seen a Chrysler minivan. This is where This is where they were born. This is the birthplace of Chrysler minivans that are ubiquitous across the land. And I said, look how big it is. It's huge. It goes into infinity almost. It's like the vanishing point is still the plant. And a friend of mine who's an urban planner, amateur cartographer, got a little light bulb in his head, and he took the Google footprint in Google Maps, Google kind of aerial view, the footprint of this big minivan plant, and laid it on downtown Toronto, because we're both Torontonians, and in our heads we were talking to Toronto people, and the scale of it just was staggering. Like, I knew it was big, but then when you lay it on to Toronto, the bottom there is like Front Street, Union Station, and the top line is Bloor Street. That little oval is Queen's Park. So if you've been to Toronto, maybe you can kind of understand a bit of the geography, kind of going up Yonge Street, going up University Avenue. It's 5 subway stops if you rode the subway. And I've walked this and rode my bike here. Like, I could intimately understand the geography of Toronto because I know it so well by traveling it in such different ways, subway, walking, biking, that suddenly the scale of the minivan plant was put in perspective. And so coming back to Windsor, I've been continuing over the last 20 years, trying to rediscover this place I thought I knew, this place that taught me everything I knew, but I didn't know it. And one of the things I really love is CWATS, the Countywide Active Transportation, not strategy, system. When I, growing up in the 90s, when I would sometimes ride I grew up in Tecumseh, lived in Tecumseh. I'd sometimes ride my bike to University of Windsor, but not that often. But I would barely ever ride in the county because that just meant death. Cars going 90, 100, tiny little shoulders, no shoulders. But this project has really liberated, for me anyway, the county. So I often bring my bicycle back, and I've rode from, my mom still lives in Tecumseh, so I rode from her house through the rail trails down to Amherstburg, something I never did before. So I'm getting this like really slow view of the place I used to see at 80 kilometers an hour. There's marshes outside of Amherstburg that the rail trail goes through that I had no idea existed. And then on Thanksgiving, last month, when it was like 80, 90 degrees or something, like it was really hot. Climate change, I don't know. I took my bike down to Harrow, drove down to Harrow, and rode the rail trail all the way into Kingsville. There's that nice Kingsville station, old train station, and then all the way to Point Pelee and almost the point, and then rode back. It was a nice 90-kilometer loop. So it was a little, I went a little too far, but I got, because I was dead at the end. But I was just like, I'd never seen this part of the county from this perspective. I even got thrown off by Kingsville, this place I always, just drove through on either the north-south highway or the east-west, what we used to call Highway 18. And the way the rail trail cuts through the town, it's at a different angle and it crosses, and I was thrown off a few times, like, where is this? And I had to look at my map and it's like, okay, I get it. It's like the geography got expanded and threw me off, and I have to look at the map, and it all kind of went back into place. And it was so fascinating and exciting that I rode too far and I could barely walk the next day. But I think it's such a wonderful thing. And that's, I think, also a really great thing that Windsor has going for it, that there's county and city are really kind of close. And I know there's tensions between the county and city, political and otherwise, mega hospitals, etc. But here in Toronto, in the GTA, the countryside is so far away, and if it's rush hour, it might take 2 hours to get to a farm field or a forest that's not an urban forest. Whereas Windsor, you can just get out there in a snap because it's a smaller town. And one of the most wonderful things is just being in the fields south of Windsor or one of the county roads, and like looking at the city and then seeing Detroit rise above it. It's almost like that cartoon view of a city from the hinterland, which never really can happen because the cities are usually just too big. But in Windsor, you kind of get this almost comic book compression of space, of countryside and city, which is really fascinating. Just a couple other things. I know Professor Schmidt is here. The Windsor Law Center for I think Cities is a really great thing, great initiative in the city. We have a lot of think tanks in big cities, but I think there's a lot people can learn from smaller size cities, mid-sized cities. We were happy to publish a version of the long history of cycling in Windsor that the Center for Cities published earlier in the fall on our blog Spacing, to sort of take the conversation about cycling in cities outside of Montreal and Toronto, where it usually happens, to a place like Windsor, where I think people up here can learn from it. I know there's been mention of the Canadian Urban Institute's Windsor program, and I believe that happened in June, but the report is coming out on December 8th. So I think that will also be very interesting, the amount of effort and research that they put into that, and the amount of people that they talk to might be a way of understanding other mid-sized cities. So that will come out on December 8th. Now I'll just kind of segue into the complaint section of my talk, where how the pandemic has brought up a whole bunch of issues that were always simmering there. Like even at Spacing Magazine, we had to have a conversation early on where we said we said to ourselves, we can't be seen as being kind of like capitalizing on the pandemic and saying, I told you so, like, because so much of the pandemic played out in public space, and the issues that we would have been talking about somewhat ineffectively for 17 years now suddenly were the issues. And so I had some snarky columns in the Toronto Star. Maybe the headline's more snarky than I write. I try not to write that snarky, but the punishment that was being kind of directed at public spaces was inconsistent with the amount of cases of COVID that were being generated in public space, right? Most of the COVID cases were in domestic situations or long-term homes or workplaces, but those are behind closed doors and harder to get to from policy perspectives, and just can't see it. Whereas if there's a crowded park, people could see it. And so I complained that all our, I think basically every one of our city councillors, and of course the mayor in Toronto, are all homeowners, and yet it's a city largely of, I think we're towards 50% apartment dwellers, whether that's condo or rental. So the parks are their are their living rooms, and that tension has kind of happened throughout the pandemic. The first big thing was in High Park here. I live near it, so I'm gesturing towards it. They have the annual cherry blossom blooming in May, which has, because of Instagram, become a massive selfie spot and just totally mobbed. Maybe probably even in normal times a bit too much. but the city put fences around the entirety of Hyde Park. It's a massive park. It's the Central Park of Toronto, and they fenced the whole thing off to keep people out of the cherry blossom. So it was a bit of an overreach, and they set up. It was the first real egregious overreach at the beginning of the pandemic, and Toronto set up a webcam to watch the cherry blossoms bloom. Watch that, and you can laugh out loud at Toronto if you want right now. But I guess the city says that they had lots of hits, hundreds of thousands of people tuned in to watch the cherry blossoms blow. But it also caught this guy. He jumped the fence with his bike or got through, and in the middle of the night, he peed in front of the cherry blossom webcam. And so the police came out and said, "Well, we will find this guy," and whatever. I like to think of him as a hero, civil disobedience, protesting the restrictions on public space. This is a little different, but I know a friend of mine who's a runner really complains about the fences going up in Jackson Park during bright lights, and was complaining the other day about it. And I know that it's different than the cherry blossoms, but that access to public space, when you fence it off, is a big deal to a lot of people. Public washrooms became a thing that I've written about a bunch here in Toronto and elsewhere. I'm very happy on a bike ride to find the washrooms in Dieppe Gardens open one day over the summer. But the city of Toronto wasn't opening them, same with the water fountains. And the few ones that we have, the city was able to rely on Starbucks and shops to kind of take up the slack. So there's been a growing conversation around the washroom thing. And I found, like, my editor was like, at the beginning when I wrote this is only a couple months in, April maybe, he said, no one's going to want to go to the public washrooms. So I think they will. And I was hearing from people saying, like, their mobility was limited to a few blocks if they had kids, if they had bladder problems, all kinds of things, if they were older. The lack of public washrooms kept people almost trapped in their homes. And when I wrote this, it was one of those few things the niche things that I write about that was, a universal thing. That people kind of latched into. There were lots of pictures of beaches as being, bad places. You started getting all these telephoto lens shots of compressed people, made it look more crowded than it was. There was a person in Vancouver, because beaches kept being the places that were punished, and news stories would lead with a picture of a beach, even if it wasn't about the beach. But this guy at Kitsilano Beach threw up a drone, whereas the photo, from the ground looked crowded, but the drone showed everyone was behaving well. And we had problems up here around the GTA of places like St. Catharines and Cobourg saying, locals only at their beaches. So the fight for public space became real. Going up to, this is near Wasaga Beach, tiny township. They wouldn't let anybody without, a local sticker park. So the access to Georgian Bay, getting out of the city, going to this wonderful Canadian landscape that's so celebrated is what was really severely limited. We think of this place, Ontario, Canada, as being big and vast, and it kind of is, but there's so much of it that's privatized. We went to Bon Echo this summer and couldn't get in the first day. That's where this picture is, which I ended up writing about, up north of Belleville. Lovely place, but the warden at the front said we're full, and they weren't letting more people in as other people left. So we went the next day when it was raining and got in. But despite the amount of land that we have in this country, so much is privatized, so much shoreline is privatized, cottages, etc. And so the actual places those of us who are uncottaged could access, the space is pretty limited. Sidewalks are too small. There's an artist here in Toronto named Daniel Rothstein who did this thing called the social distance machine, where he fashioned this kind of giant hula hoop and walked down the street, and they did a video of it, and he could barely walk down the street without hitting the buildings or being in the streets and amid other people. And this is when, public health was saying, stay 6 feet away, well, we don't have enough space. Maybe we've given too much over to cars. There's been big debates about drinking in public space in bigger cities, in apartment-heavy cities where people don't have their own backyards. Calgary, Vancouver have tried pilot projects of allowing drinking. It's a little bit awkward in the kind of like, you can drink in this section, but not in this drink in this section. But they're at least trying. Here in Toronto, we had you probably saw pictures of it because everyone likes making fun of Toronto. The Great Hipster Freakout in May, the first May of the pandemic, and in Trinity Bellwoods, the hipster park here, and the city tried to one of the councillors tried to make a motion to allow people to drink in public spaces without being harassed, but the city said no. They said no, there's public health things, and it was actual progressives that were saying no. But it was an unprogressive thing to do because, you know, and the compromise that they came to was that the police and bylaw would not harass people who were drinking in public, having a beer in the park or whatever. But we know, you know, who gets harassed, you know, people of color, younger people. And so it was progressives making extremely unprogressive decisions during this. And the Ombudsman Toronto report that came out earlier in the summer that looked at the early COVID response found that it was really heavy-handed in punishing a public space, but leaving the private spaces, the workplaces, sort of behind. That's the place we didn't poke into. Just a few more minutes before I'll finish up and we can talk. There's kind of a real interesting tension that kind of grew during the pandemic about, you know, cars versus space for people. In Toronto on the left, we started this thing called Cafe TO, everything in Toronto is with a TO, and it allowing parking spaces to become patio space for the adjacent restaurants. And this was the hardest thing to do. Urbanists have been fighting for it forever. And suddenly the pandemic hit and they needed all this outdoor space, and merchants were like, okay, yeah, this is great. And before they would never want to give up the parking. And it really transformed Toronto streets into this beautiful thing that rather than just this expansive pavement, most restaurants would put plants in and little umbrellas, and they made it kind of beautiful and lush. And walking down a few of our streets this summer, no one would ever confuse Toronto with like a beautiful European city, say, but it felt like Barcelona or Rome or Lisbon. Sometimes it's the closest Toronto ever did, as one patio went to the other, and it was just lovely. And coming about in July, I came to Windsor to celebrate my mom's 75th birthday, so we took her to Erie Street for dinner, my sister and I, and it was such a pleasant surprise to see that Erie Street was shut down to cars that weekend. And as more people came to the restaurant just brought out more tables. So this was at the beginning of the night, and by the end of the night, the tables had gone over the center line, which is kind of how it works in other places, but not so much in Ontario. So it was nice to see kind of these kind of liberations of public space. This is Lakeshore that was closed a number of weekends to allow for active transportation. Lakeshore here in Toronto, which is great. Thousands and thousands of people would be out on their bikes because it was suddenly a safe place for entire families to go and ride. And again, it felt like Amsterdam. It didn't feel like Toronto. Yeah, Windsor had the kind of bump at the beginning with I think the only major city that canceled transit. But since then, through the pandemic, there's been great stuff with, you know, active transit, lobbying for somewhat successfully, seems almost, for increased transit, and the Windsor Essex Youth Climate Council, the pop-up separated bike lanes on University, which I think would do which would connect the university's campus with its downtown campus so much more safely and better, and actually just kind of make University this beautiful corridor. I mean, these are artist renderings that were floated around a month or two ago, but if it looks anything like this, if it looks anything like some of the pop-up lanes we've had in Toronto, where planters and things are put out, once it happens, it kind of brings beauty to something that we didn't think was beautiful before. And here in Toronto, I think we're suffering just as we're coming out of the pandemic with cuts to transit. Some of it being blamed on having to let go unvaccinated TTC workers. But it seems just like there was this retreat into people's private spaces, into private cars, and just when we might be stepping back out, we are maybe going a bit backwards. And through the pandemic, there were a lot of car-oriented things that were good, like the Windsor Film Festival's drive-in. They did a drive-in here at Ontario Place, but I think we do have to be a bit wary of, you know, the car becoming totally domineering. This is the Tim Hortons in Wasaga Beach when we were there in the summer, and I walked to the Tim Hortons because I thought it'd be better to walk, and the lineup was out the door so slow, and I just watched the drive-through at the same Tim Hortons just fly through. And I think this is a thing for places with drive-throughs. They focus on the car more than the walk-in, more than the human. So just seeing these kind of little things, like calling curbside at a walk-up place, like you don't really use you don't park at the curb when you walk up to a place. This idea of curbside shopping and that sort of thing. But then also like more other kind of quotidian liberations of public space. Going into suburbs. This is a picture from Ottawa, not my picture, but seeing places, that kind of suburban form of driveway in front, garage in front. You'd never see people. And on my long bike rides and explorations of Toronto, and other places, I just routinely see people meeting in their front yards. It's like suddenly like the people kind of came out, which was an interesting thing. And here in Toronto, there was a switch in the tone of things, with telling people what they can do versus what they can't do. And actually, I use this as my Twitter name, which I need to get rid of, 3 Geese Radius. But this is the first positive sign I saw in Toronto of telling people to do the right thing in public space rather than just punishing them for being there. Stay 3 geese apart. And this is, of course, Trinity Bellwoods on the left. Also another thing people made fun of in Toronto, or across the country and elsewhere, of putting these circles in, which was actually a copy of a park in San Francisco, the hipster park in San Francisco, the name of which escapes me. So we didn't actually come up with it. But at the end of last summer, the circles that people thought were a bit absurd, I went there and the grass inside the circles were worn out, so people actually used it. It was a success. And then Trinity Bellwoods later was the site of the first real violent encampment evictions, and so that was an evolution of the sort of second wave of the bad days of public space here in Toronto and in other cities, Ottawa, Hamilton. Windsor actually did quite a good job of avoiding this, of talking to people, and as far as I can tell from away, moving people out of the park without having to throw cops and violence and all the sorts of things you probably saw on the news. And that's ongoing here. The 3 big evictions that they had at Toronto parks, the park up the street from me, Dufferin Grove, has a lot of encampments, and I think the city's trying to change tack a bit because there was such an outrage around around those evictions and how far-flung those images went. And so that kind of morphs in, that kind of leads into the housing crisis that we're experiencing here in Canada, and all of those kind of really bigger things. And so the pandemic, it was kind of showed us what can be done in a hurry when we need to do it, and also became the sort of scapegoat for blaming people because it was easier just to see people in public and think that they're the bad ones. But just seeing like those hipsters frolicking in Trinity Bellwoods and all those other kind of beach pictures and whatever, all those headlines about the end of the city, it's almost like they were being proven false in action. It was really hard to keep people away from each other. And so that kind of gave me faith that people are going to get back. But that end of the city's narrative was really it was a very white upper middle class thing. People that could work from home. For lots of people that kept the city running, the service workers, the hospital workers. The city never went away, but they had to negotiate it physically, despite all these restrictions and that sort of thing. So maybe I'll stop here and we can chat or ask questions or give your own Windsor examples about things.
Thank you so much, Shawn. We have a few minutes left. I know not a pile of time. There's so much there to discuss. I'm going to call on Gush if you'd like to ask the first question. And if others have questions as well, please feel free to put your hand up. I know there isn't a huge amount of time, but we'll try and sneak a couple in if we can. Go ahead, Gush.
I just want to say, first off, thank you so much for your presentation. A lot to take home with me. With my question specifically, it was a bit of what you touched on earlier. I actually moved into Windsor this fall, so it's my first time experiencing the city. and I'm coming from Toronto, so it's a lot smaller than I'm accustomed to. And, you know, being as a law student, you don't necessarily always kind of have that time, but it's felt in my experience anyway that you really need to drive to get around in a lot of places. The city is kind of built around that with the roadways. So I was wondering your opinion, how would someone in my position be able to discover the city like you mentioned?
Well, if you're a cyclist, you know, cycle, but just walk, go for walks. And I bet you if you posted on Facebook, does anyone want to go for a walk, or whatever social media or some other way? People will walk with you, because I found a group of people that walk, and we still walk 20 years after moving here. People have left and gone and come, but we still kind of go on walks every few months, and it's sort of like a roving cocktail party a little bit, but it's outside, and we're just looking at stuff and talking with each other. And then I was actually the first social things that we did during the pandemic with friends was just go for a walk, because we could. And I bet you will find people who would go for a walk with you. And the city will reveal, not its secrets necessarily, but will be way more interesting than I think we think it is.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Ember, do you want to jump in with a question?
Sure. Hi there. Hope you can hear me okay.
Yep. Ember.
Great. Well, I also wanted to thank you so much for your discussion today. I'm actually heading to Toronto this week by train for a concert, so I'll be really excited to look for that painting and also the Anishinaabe Bay street signs as well. So my question is actually largely related to housing. And you started your talk about the positive aspects about living in a border city. And I do hate to bring a negative light into this perspective, because I do agree that there's just so much beauty in, you know, being so close to Detroit. But I did grow up in Sarnia, which is a border city to Port Huron, Michigan, and as well as within the Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And based on where I was raised, when I think about border cities, I can't help but ignore the dangerous aspects as well within them. So, you know, like the cycle of poverty, which of course is everywhere, but this paired with, you know, an increased risk for like things like human trafficking or vulnerable populations specifically within border cities. So on a semi-related note, I'm working on a research paper for Dr. Smith's course. And my topic is whether a tiny home movement, if legalized, or even, you know, like a tent community, would help solve issues of homelessness and, you know, financial freedom, environmental sustainability, that kind of thing. So my question is, I'm wondering if you have a perspective on, you know, whether this would be beneficial and whether, you know, living in a border community would actually make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's a important like middle ground, middle step before I don't think we don't want people to live, you know, forever in a tiny home. The tiny shelters, maybe that's what we had. There was a guy here in Toronto, a carpenter, who took it upon himself to build tiny shelters and put them out in the encampments. And the city sent him a cease and desist. And he sort of became, I guess in a little ways, a folk hero. But the city was saying, you know, they were dangerous and they were fire and flammable. And I wrote about this in the Star at some point, and that, you know, maybe the city could work with him. You know, like if you've been to Toronto, there's cranes everywhere, right? We know how to build things here. There's an incredible amount of architectural talent, developer talent, and as far as I know, nobody in those communities stood up to, you know, say we could help you, maybe lend you some of our skills in building, in designing, but also our social capital, because, you know, the city might not bulldoze us if, you know, somebody from a top architecture firm is involved. But there was a real silence there, which I think was a great disappointment. So I think if you could tap into the civil society of you know, those industries that are making buttloads of money off of home building, and get them involved, or at least some of them involved, it might make it a more less of a kind of outlier thing. But that would be a very
okay. Thank you.
I would read your paper when it's done.
Great. That's fantastic.
Make sure you have access. You'll make sure to facilitate that for sure. Thanks so much, Ember. I think we have time for one last question. Claudia, if you have a question you wanted to ask. I don't see any other hands up. If I'm missing anyone, please just speak up.
Yeah, so perfect. And I just want to echo, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You spoke about a lot of great things about cities and also some of, your criticisms of cities. And I'm just wondering now what you would like to see in cities moving forward, some, main areas for improvement and where you'd like to see the city perhaps, several or even many years from now.
I think the number one thing is addressing the housing crisis, making the cities affordable for people to live there, for people like you who graduate and with, I don't know, lots of law debt and just start out your careers and be able to afford to live in a place maybe where you have to live, like Toronto with all its circuit of law firms, and yet the city makes it incredibly hard for you to live here. So you could live close to the place you live. So maybe when we get old, we could live in the same neighborhood by aging in place, by finding a downsizing, finding a nearby apartment that are often resisted by NIMBYs and zoning laws and that sort of thing. But I think making that housing side of it, solving that housing side of it, or working towards solving it, making it affordable, would unlock a lot of other things that are troubling in the city, in the sense that sorry, I'm rambling a bit. The housing thing is just such a key barrier to living the quality of life and just being able to live here prosperously and having a happy, good life. That if we figure that out, and we did at one point. If you look at Canada after the war, after World War II, we built housing gangbusters, like CMHC, Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. We built subdivisions, sprawl, of course, but we also built loads and loads of apartments, small and tall, huge. There's over 2,000 slab apartment towers built in the mid-century here in Toronto that house an awful lot of people relatively affordable. And it was a nation building project. It wasn't just like a thing on a political agenda, kind of like it is now. It was a nation building push. And I think we unfortunately probably need to get that high in the crisis, or it affects middle class people, which is in big cities, that the political pressure will kind of do that. But I think it needs to be on that scale.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. You got my most rambly question. And sorry for going a little too long, because anyway.
Well, that's all right. No, it was a great conversation and really always a fascinating presentation that you provide us. Rich food for thought. And I encourage everyone to check out Spaces and your Twitter feed. And I'd like just to end by thanking you so much for coming both for our Humanities Week in October and joining us again today. I think this is a great way to end our fall season. And I wish you all the best. And I hope you won't be a stranger to HRG and our other events.
I would happily come back. And I saw somebody put in the chat that there's a Windsor Facebook walking group. And even somebody posted about Pokemon. Like those things are great. Those games that get people out into the city and using the city as like a game board or stage. Those aren't silly. Those are wonderful. But I'll be back in the holidays going for a walk somewhere in Windsor.
Wonderful. Maybe we'll bump into you. Anyway, thanks so much, Shawn, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for your attention. And we'll let everyone get back to their day. But just a reminder, this has been recorded. So once we figure out the passwords to our YouTube channel, we will post it on our websites for people to view in case they came late. And thank you, Annika, for doing all the pinch hitting and monitoring the chat and the questions.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. And thank you, Shawn.
Thank you both. And thanks
to the students for your questions.
Students, yeah.
Thanks. And so